So, welcome. I guess most of my students are participating as attendees. There's about 30 of them out there, but we've been at this since about January. So we're a two-quarter, fourth years architecture undergrad studio, and you guys all know the LA Metro program, so I won't talk too much about it. But it's obviously been an intense couple quarters. So this is our 2020 year. A remarkable group of students, uh, super wonderful people. We definitely got to know each other, but we didn't get to go on our field trips. And then, we had to, as everybody else, had to leave our studio, which, by the way, well, I'm not going to talk about it. Across the street got a lot of damage a couple days ago, but the building's still there. And now they're all living in various places, and things are still happening. And I don't know. They've been hanging in there, and as most people, they're being extremely resilient and doing some great work. I don't do this alone, and the faculty are out there. They're probably either attending as attendees or they're going to come in later. They have a different kind of schedule. So I direct the program, but I also have been teaching with Ismael Soto, who he's actually a former Cal Poly student who also has gone on to UCLA and then worked for Zaha and Kopim and Blau and UN Studio, and he assisted in studio with the design work. I guess I'm on a timer there. And then Pavel Getov, who you may or may not know, you should know him. He's a former Morphosis person who has his own practice, and he teaches design and practice with us, particularly in the second half of the studio. He does a lot of the design development. He worked on all the big buildings, like the Federal Building and the Caltrans and Cooper Union. So he adds an enormous amount to our studio in terms of design development skills. Teddy Slowick also been teaching mostly in the design and practice, and he has two students that we added into the program in the second half, which will come on a different day. Fabio Zangoli does structures, so Fabio's fantastic, and he comes in the second half also to help us with some structures. And we have HTC, history theory, and criticism with Sarah Hearne and Alex Maymind. So we have like an integrated program. It's 30 students, but we all work as a team. And there's one program, one studio, and that's kind of been the way in which we've engaged it. So we have until about noon, and so we have about almost 30 minutes per student, which is fantastic. We have our very illustrious group of critics. So I'm really excited you guys are able to do this. Can't usually get a lot of them to come here, so this is fantastic because we're on a budget. But Erin Besler, Besler and Sons at Princeton, assistant professor. She's a terrific architect, and I see you as also sculpturally talented from, I guess, your early background from Yale. Neil Denari, we all know, NMDA, also from professor at UCLA, who interned some of our students. We'll be seeing a couple of those today. Paul Lewis, who gave a lecture earlier with us. So he's back. Thank you, Paul. Associate Dean at Princeton, and also, the big LTL office. So I've known him for a while. Lance Simon, over there, Lance. He's from Egan Simon. He's an architect, building buildings here, well, actually a lot of places, but including Los Angeles and housing, things of that nature. So thank you, Lance. We've met before he was here on our reviews last year. Fantastic. And Ron Witte from WW Architects, now at Harvard professor, and also a former Cal Poly grad, for all of you who didn't know that. So he's one of our peeps out there in the world. So he's a great contact and connection. We have 4 students presenting today: Curt Budd, Ryan Lau, Kevin Wu, and then Trevor Allen, this morning's group. Curt's over there in the corner. You can see him. Just really quickly, generally the way we run the studio, we start with an architectural exploration to give them some formal ideas or formal interests that have sectional qualities and spatial qualities, usually surrounding geometries that then get embedded in a site. And so it's a setup to give them, I guess, an inspiration and architectural interest that they can work on the whole 2 quarters. Our program this year is a multi-income housing and hotel project. It has a bunch of social and health services as well embedded in it, creative office spaces, and retail. So it's quite a large project. It has a lot of public exterior and interior spaces. We generally fill about 50% of the block, and I'll explain that as well. And so we're looking a lot, and we've been reading a little bit about spaces in between. The general program, the housing is about 250,000 square feet, which I know is quite large. Micro unit housing, about 25,000. Transient hotels, about 20,000. Boutique hotel, 30,000. As I said, it's a multi-income, multi-social type environment. There's high to mid-income housing, there's mid to low-income housing, and there's transitional family housing as well. And then family services also are built into the project. There's a large commercial and public space, about 400,000 plus square feet. There's public restaurants. I gotta catch my spellings. Cafes, cafeterias, retails, and there's flexible creative office space as well. Exhibition gallery spaces and a lot of public land space, about 50,000. So overall, there's about 660,000 square feet. And our lot here in Los Angeles is here's downtown, here's the fashion district, here's Skid Row. We're kind of on this interesting moment on Main Street where the grid comes together. And it's this block right here between 8th and 9th Street. So it's a fairly empty lot in terms of most of being, yeah? We good? Yeah, being mostly a parking lot. And so we've taken the entire lot, which is basically about 625 feet by 175 feet. So it's 110,000 square foot print. We're allowed to go 12 stories high. And so they're gonna end up with a 660,000 square foot building. So you're generally looking at about a 50% porosity that's guaranteed in the system. So there's going to be a lot of open spaces and starting to think about urbanistically. So generally we break down into 3 clear strategies looking at sort of spaces in between. There's an architectural concept, form and material. There'll be an urban concept. They'll have a clear site strategy. And then they'll have an organizational programmatic concept that comes up maybe mostly in section and plan that can become socio-political as they choose based on where they put things. So that is me, that's all I'm gonna say. And I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Something that you guys maybe saw, we have these links to Concept Board. Do you guys know Concept Board? The students have their work on Concept Board, but they'll be presenting in a PowerPoint. So if you can't access it, that's okay. But if you can access it separately, you can also follow along and draw on it and engage in a conversation. So Curt, why don't you go for it?
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us. We all very much appreciate it. So my name is Curt. This is my project, which I've called Associate and Dissociate. Really quickly, I'll just kind of introduce some of the design concepts. Looks like Stephen really took care of a lot of the site information, and then kind of walk through the project and wrap up with some details and material articulation. So before kind of digging into it, I just wanted to show an overall image of the project. I've been presented kind of in this format before, so I thought it might be helpful just to have something that you guys can kind of keep in the back of your minds. So as Stephen said, very programmatically diverse, a lot to fit into this site in LA. Kind of the things that I took away is that it's very oblong and it needs to be very porous. So my kind of site strategies have been to divide the volume into a lower 1/3 and an upper 2/3, and that lower 1/3 really becoming the public space of the building, while the upper 2/3 houses the housing units and some of the office space, some of the spaces that I wanted to keep more private. And then I also started to look how cutting across the site, I can generate some porosity for circulation, light, community spaces, and then sloping down into the site to create a strong connection to the streetscape. And then kind of prior to the site thinking, we did some brief architectural explorations. And so mine dealt primarily with conglomeration and these kind of discrete parts and how they're coming together and maybe referencing each other. And so when I start to look at the site with the site concepts and my kind of tectonic ideas adapting to each other, I really wanted to explore how conglomeration, embedding, and slicing can start to form these strategic associations and dissociations from one program to another program and from the programs to the site. These two diagrams kind of catalog the final massing strategy of the program. So I'm trying to show how that bottom 1/3 really does become a folding up of the streetscape and offer kind of these pauses and terraced moments, which have entries to programs, and it elevates some of the entry points, not just on the streetscape. And then meanwhile, that upper 2/3 that houses the office and housing space really becomes detached and more privatized. This image is just intended to reinforce the idea of that urban gesture and how this street starts to fold up into these staircases, and there's some little terraces in here that form entries into these public programs. And starting the walkthrough with that public program in the first 3 levels of the building. Again, the one thing I want to drive home is that these stairs emerging on the left side, but also kind of this central void that begins to develop in the middle of the building. And it starts to mirror the street and provide sort of internal street front. There are retail spaces on the inside here, and then moving up to the 2nd floor, this area right here, which you can kind of see in these diagrams, becomes this kind of public amenity and community resource center with some educational spaces. And this really has the strongest connection to the street and the most immediate opportunities for entry into the building. And then looking at this in section longitudinally, you can see the retail zone and sort of this cavernous central void, which is intended to help bring light and the desired porosity into the project. Kind of moving away from the public-oriented programs a little bit. On this right side is where we have the boutique and transient hotel, and that sits above a gallery space. And then these little chunks which are getting cut through are community spaces which start to connect kind of these 2 housing wings. And then the office space is the first kind of program to fully occupy this sort of floating or removed 2/3 piece of the project. And the housing sits at the very highest level. And kind of the need for this was, one, to bring light as much as possible into the housing. So being on top of the building, I thought it had the greatest opportunities for sort of porous geometries. And so in the roof plan, again, I'm trying to show how those community spaces bridge between these 2 housing wings. And then in this program diagram, I'm showing how this housing zone also connects to a shared amenity zone, which in turn connects to this micro housing community, which caps this hotel space. Looking at the section here, I've tried to organize some programmatic thoughts in a more vertical manner. So at the top are the 2 housing zones. Again, that community bridge space. And then at this level 7 right here is a large courtyard, which is accessible for the office workers and for residents of the housing. So it becomes a public space, but only within the building. And then moving down, this central void runs all the way through the project and is intended to bring light all the way down to this ground level, where I'm trying to sort of reestablish some semblance of street frontage with interior retail spaces. And then this is a visualization of that courtyard space. And so this is kind of that community bridge between these 2 housing wings. And in this cross section, I really wanted to try and communicate how the idea of association and dissociation plays itself out on the inside of the building. And so in moments like these, I have this kind of long light well that brings light into these office spaces here. So you have this sort of distant connection with the exterior, which contrasts sort of these long ambulating circulation spaces. This was a staircase that sort of originally started at the streetscape, and it is adjacent to these internal spaces which kind of release back into this void in the building. And then moving up, this relationship here is kind of inversed, where this stair in this office zone becomes more communal and public to the inside of the building, while this space is kind of tucked away and its occupants focused is pushed back towards the outside. So I've started to try and interpret the intersection of these masses as these walls that fold around different spaces in different ways to direct users' attention differently depending on where they are in the building. So kind of finishing off with some assembly and material ideas. This is sort of a three-dimensional look at the previous part of the previous cross section, where I started to try and express those folded geometries a little bit more. And then the structure of the project, I'm envisioning kind of a typical steel construction. And then the material concepts that I've been working with essentially invert the ideas of association and dissociation of the forms. So that lower third becomes kind of this long system of wood panels, which when I think of LA, I don't typically think of an expansive wood paneled project. And so while that part of the massing is physically strongly associated with the streetscape material, it becomes sort of this experience that dissociates the user from the typical LA context. And then meanwhile, that upper 2/3 portion, maybe when somebody is approaching at a distance, they're seeing this sort of white GFRC with bunched openings, something more typical for the context. And so from a ways away, they might see this building and begin to form an idea in their mind and expect a certain thing. But then as they move closer and start to see this angle geometry emerging from the groundscape, they're perhaps a little bit surprised by what's going on. And then closing out with just a couple more images that are intended to drive home some of the concepts and the differentiation between the massing and the upper 2/3 and the lower third. This is a street corner down here and the opposite street corner, which is showing a boutique hotel space right here and a gallery space in this area right here. And you can kind of visualize how those stairs bleed into the streetscape. So that kind of concludes the slideshow presentation. And from what I understand, Stephen, we have a couple of options. We can kind of stay here and flip through the slideshow or move over to concept board.
I would let the critics kind of,
okay.
They might look at the concept board. They might tell you to go back a slide or two. They have a few minutes. Yeah, let them run it. It's nice to be able to see something on your board too, shared.
One quick question, because I'm trying to understand the difference between the idea that this thing was one large mass in which you carved out kind of areas inside of it versus the idea that it's, you know, two forms that have been placed next to each other. So when you do that space in here, is it associated with single loaded corridors along it? And I guess I probably need the plan. In other words, when you wrap, do you see this space as uniquely different, or is this the residue of two forms on either side of it?
So I'm trying to squint at the last dotted line you drew. So can you say that one more time?
Yeah, so look, I'm just trying to understand a little bit more the agency of the void in here. Okay. Is it the residue of the fact you have two figures on either side of it? Or is it something that's been designed intentionally as a kind of separation between things? Is it a space unto itself? Do you wrap the same facade on the inside as you do on the outside? I'm just trying to get a better understanding of how you're thinking about that central space, because it seems to be a kind of key component to the entire strategy.
Right. So it definitely started as sort of this interstitial leftover space between the placing of two objects side by side. And then from there, I've tried to sort of collectively slice those objects and try to erase sort of the initial seam, if you will. And then I am starting to kind of wrap that interior facade with the same language that I'm using on the exterior.
You can take them back to that slide, or you can
Oh,
also
yeah.
take them to the plan, which I think they wanted to look at.
Yeah, so kind of these angled cuts, which create this window within the building, are the same geometries that I've been working with to slice the exterior walls. And is this the plan that you wanted to see?
I mean, it's the curse of Zoom is I mean, it's a pretty, I mean, it's a big building. It's complicated. There's a lot of things going on here. It's really well developed. I mean, and trying to, I mean, like I keep thinking if I get myself closer to the screen, I can read it
Yeah,
better, right? Yeah, like,
right.
but no, because I'm just, I mean, I'm just trying to go between the idea that this thing's, you know, how do you go from the moment where it's this very kind of figural objects to something that now has this articulation of specific use, and you know, and how did those different strategies start to kind of mesh, and where do you have, I mean, for me it's kind of when you start doing a void inside, is it a residue of some other ambition or is it self? I mean, in other words, I think, you know, the key to this project would seem to be that at the base of this thing, when you're way down on the retail level, you're in some amazing space. And is it sufficiently intentional, or is it the result of trying to just take a footprint that's too wide to occupy and plan, and so you're having to stick a void in the middle of it? So, and obviously you want the former, and I'm just
Right.
trying to evaluate it in those terms and try to see it relative to all the things that's going on. And same thing with the long stair, which I really like urbanistically when I'm on the stair. I'm now trying to figure out when I'm underneath the stair, am I enjoying that space, right? And trying to, so in other words, a lot of these kind of fairly aggressive gestural operations have consequences that are very specific, and just trying to figure out, you know, are you getting the spaces, the qualities, the effects, the urban, the programmatic that you're, and I, you know, it's a huge amount of work in a short period of time. Just, but those are the correct questions that I'm bringing, you know, as I'm looking at all this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe sort of in response to your comment about spaces underneath the stair, I've tried to express that a little bit kind of in this zone of the section. And I sort of have these three kind of intersecting objects, and then trying to kind of open up fenestration in this area and bring light down to here. So it's another one of those scenarios where maybe you're kind of in this space down here and you're receiving daylight, but you're not exactly sure or where it's coming from, and you don't directly see it. So it becomes maybe sort of this ephemeral experience. So I'm trying to translate that awkward stair geometry into hopefully something positive.
Mm-hmm.
I have a reaction, Curt, that maybe is along the same lines as yours, Paul, but originates in a different location. In passing, you made a really interesting reference.
Mm-hmm.
That was to a void that was a chunk, and I really liked that. And the thing that I think is interesting in relation to what Paul is raising, I think Paul is putting his finger in the center of it. I think it's absolutely the subject here. So what's the relationship between the solid chunks and what I think you were characterizing in that phrase as the negative chunks?
Right.
And I would try to push them into equivalence in any way that I could, so that you would not be able to understand so much the distinction. I think right now the chunks that are pronounced are the solid ones, the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And the void as a chunk is a kind of leftover. It's a kind of a remnant of what happens when you put them together. I was trying to figure out how to do that. There are a bunch of things that I would try to do. One of them might be, for example, to simply measure the number of surfaces and corners that it takes to articulate a solid chunk, and how many surfaces and corners does it take to articulate a negative chunk, and try to make sure that the counts come into a kind of parity somehow.
Okay.
The other thing is this section, I was comparing this section to the plan previous, the floor 11 plan. And the floor 11 plan already starts to do that, whereas this section, the section we were just looking at doesn't so much. But I think this section does, for example, let me see if I can get in here. Hold on a second. It does, for example, in here, there's a kind of equivalence in that big block of space and the void that's in front of it. They get sort of tangled up at that moment. I think that's really interesting. Whereas over on the sides of these guys, for example, those become perimeters. The solids become more normal as solids.
Right.
So I think that's super interesting, actually. The idea that there's a different definition of inside outside. There's a different definition of institutional boundary. All kinds of things in there are really, really interesting. But if you could figure out a way to make solid and void basically equal, I think that would be a really amazing starting point. And you're kind of launching it the way you're describing it. I'm not sure if that's what you were aiming at, but I would not see that as a kind of residual in the middle.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I really like the discussion about solid and void, but I think that, I mean, one thing I was thinking was that your project, I mean, I just keep thinking about those units, the living units, and the amount of, or let's say like the spectrum along which difference is produced across them, and like how much you're actually, getting, how much difference you're actually getting across them, and how much you actually want. So it seems like there's a desire in the project to minimize the amount of difference across the living units, to try to like have some kind of cookie cutter thing. And of course, for various reasons, economics and scales of time and production and construction and all of those things, I mean, maybe that's something to work with. But I think in just thinking about the conversation about solid and void and how we, you can begin to think about those as operating on different scales to produce perhaps more difference across things on the interior, and that the corridor actually isn't the thing that's always making up the difference between the kind of like standard unit and architectural sort of expression of the form. I guess I'd like to see more somehow like architecture on the interior. I mean, whatever that means, like more design of the interior. But right now it seems like the corridors are doing the things to kind of buffer out all of the difference and like all of the work that you're producing through the big kind of like formal moves of the exterior. And then similarly in a conversation about difference, I would wonder how much you actually want between the, I guess, living housing area and kind of louvered office space area. I mean, it seems like it's really coded in a way to produce a reading of perhaps not just 2 or 3 buildings on the site, but like when you look at, I mean, when you start to look at it, you can read it as like even like 6 or 7 or I don't know, much more. And I think the project really kind of, I guess for me, really revolves around a calibration of how you deal with, I guess, using the sophistication of the solid and void, or producing void chunks to control and calibrate the registration of difference across the site. And whether it's the big moves on the exterior or I guess smaller smaller scale moves on the interior as you get into the living units and I guess the office spaces or commercial spaces and things like this.
Right. So if I understand correctly, you're kind of saying the exterior seems like maybe there are 6 or 7 kind of different buildings that are kind of coming together, and the interior really is not reflecting that and seems more homogenized.
It seems like there's a desire to articulate different things on the exterior in different ways. And okay. That the interior, and whatever that desire was, for all the work it's doing for you and all that you've invested into it, it seems like the plans become quite normative, and that's right. At least to me, it seems like that's because the corridor is actually the thing that's absorbing all of the difference, or really registering. You're allowing it to kind of like eat up the space between the kind of formal designed exterior and what we oftentimes want for a lot of housing units, for them to be repeatable and them to be the same. And I guess I wonder if there's a different attitude that the project might present in terms of how we think about, I don't know, like standardization, repeatability, and things like this. And a way to produce that conversation might be to think about the way that these moves operate on the exterior versus the consequences for them in terms of the overall form versus the kind of workings of the interior, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's also kind of like symptomatic of kind of where I spent my time working. And I definitely had a heavier focus on exterior. And if I were to continue on, the interior focus would definitely be what I need to look at.
You know, I agree with Erin, and I first want to say this is one of the most remarkably resolved projects I've seen at your stage in education in a long time.
Thank you.
It's intriguing and beautiful, and it of course makes me, you know, become suspicious. But I think you did a very good job of addressing a lot of things to make it a believable and thoughtful project. And then, you know, Erin's right. Like there's this dilemma, and I'd say academically, you made a really good decision to focus on the big idea and say, all right, I know I can fit these kind of normal components within my big idea, as opposed to like the dangerous thing of trying to make really unique shaped units or something like that, and then going like, oh my God, what is the exterior of my building? What's it like to be, you know, inside or outside of it? But then that said, you know, the part that I want to like get you to keep exploring is I would love to see more images of what it's like to be in that void space that everyone else was talking about.
Yeah.
And because the next level of this thing is, you know, you were given a very complex program, and that complex program becomes even more complex because so much of it is about housing. And you've put together several different demographics of people who have very different needs, very different expectations, especially today. I used to do high-rise condos and hotels, and there's that fascinating thing about it where you kind of don't have a client. You have the flag, the hotel flag, and they have some standards. And then if they've hired you in a big design firm, then they kind of expect you to give them wow. And then you have affordable housing, which it's great in LA that I think we do really excellent affordable housing. And I mean, all of my peers. But affordable housing has very, very specific needs, and you add in families. And so there's this richness that I think if you had more time, you'd be able to add in the placemaking on a much smaller level within this very large building.
Mm-hmm.
Because I look at them like, wait, what's missing here? There's nothing green.
Yeah.
You have this huge building with all these open spaces and natural light, and you're probably going to have like some really well calculated areas of natural light and some kind of dark, you know, spaces. It's like wandering underneath Grand Avenue or into Bonaventure. In some places you go, oh my God, this is amazing. And others you're like, oh my God, this is terrifying. So
Right.
I think that the more you got into thinking about people being within your building, probably like Erin was saying, I think you'd have more richness in your plan, and you might break away from standardization within that as well.
I want to also say I think it's one of the most expert projects I've seen in the 10 years or however long it's been with the Cal Poly studio. It's pretty remarkable, especially in isolation. You've obviously got an understanding, I think, of some aspects of all the pragmatic conditions that we imagine, you know, with building, the way in which you have a wide bay that takes into, that transfers to a smaller bay, but over 5 floors with a kinked column, as opposed to transferring in a slab, and, you know, things like that, which are really amazing. And, you know, it's a giant project. And so aspects of what you explore from the very beginning by essentially how to do what urban designers in all cities want architects to do, which is break it down, right? We don't want anything monolithic. We don't want anything that has to do with sameness, even though we talk about that in terms of the aura of mesmerizing form, right? And so at some level, the project takes on the conditions of dealing with that, although that's not what you're strictly confronting. You didn't design this for, you know, for city planning in Los Angeles, but at the same time, everything that you're doing responds to conditions that, let's say, would be human. You've installed long bar buildings, courtyard buildings, C-shaped buildings, Michael Heiser scratched earth landscape elements, et cetera. I mean, if you just described all those things and asked a student to pack it into a site, it'd be a disaster. And it's coherent at that level. The only thing for me that's missing, and I think this is a little bit related to what's the moment in which the project becomes conventional. And if we see normative rooms and a corridor becoming conventional, then you'd push it to the point where maybe the one thing I'm missing is the finest grain, because everything stops at a readable big grain, because we have a tendency to really design from the outside.
Right.
And if I can't see it, then it's not worth doing, right?
Yeah.
If it doesn't show up graphically, if it doesn't show up in terms of the scale of a void, then it's not worth doing. And in essence, we kind of stop at the level of certain kinds of scale. So if I imagine going up into the building and the rooms unraveled into a finer grain of typology, like it morphs into a capsule project, you know, within the interior, as if that was the Kowloon moment, as opposed to the urban canyon moment, right?
Right.
Just for the sake of seeing how far could you push a project to contain and withstand and tolerate the biggest bandwidth of scale. So it goes to a certain level, but I know instinctively it stops there because of the way we model and work.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
We spin our models around all the time, and if I can't see it, and we have a tendency to get back, and then there's a legend. Anyway, you know what I'm saying.
Right.
Even though there's the potential for that kind of micro scale happening in your project, I think it just wasn't addressed. That's the only thing I can see. Otherwise, it's super expert.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's definitely a challenge to kind of simultaneously tackle that really small, fine-grained stuff while balancing the larger urbanistic moves.
Yeah, food for thought.
But yeah, definitely good things to consider.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Curt, you know, obviously, I think the critics have pointed out that you have extreme expertise and you did a great job. So, and under all these circumstances, very impressive. So
Thank you.
It's been fun.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for attending. My name is Kevin, and the project is titled Ruffled Monolith and was inspired by an initial project we did. I was interested in the carving of spaces using rectilinear and spherical primitives to manipulate the generic box. At the same time, I noticed this monolithic quality of the object and questioned its form and nature and texture as well. In this case, the ruffled pattern, and how this could influence the perception of the monolith in any way. So the project sits on a 660 by 160 feet lot on the edge of the Fashion District in Los Angeles and consists of 660,000 square feet of program, of mixed use program, which includes housing, hotel, retail, office, and public space. Here you can see a variety of programs distributed along the 12 stories. The retail and public space are easily accessible from the ground floor. the housing and the hotel occupy the perimeter of the upper floors, which is connected by two main atriums, and the office space sits in between. Here's sort of an overview look of how it all comes together. So carrying forward the ideas from the initial exercise, I continued exploring ways that these rectangular and spherical primitives could begin to carve out the atrium spaces and building envelope while working with the given program. Here in the front elevation, this produced sort of these interesting profiles and figures when these primitives interacted with this ruffling facade. The cut also extends into the building floor plate and groundscape to create voids and graphic elements. In this section, you can see how these recognizable primitive shapes shape the atrium and connect the opposite sides of the building. So here you have the housing on top connected by this primitive cut. And then here you have more community space and housing behind. Similarly, this also happens along this office floor and joining that all the way down to create these open spaces for employees to enjoy. Similarly, this section cut creates these community spaces where the residents can share on opposite ends, and a larger cut is made along the 4th to 6th floor to create this large open auditorium where the walls are thickened. Here in the longitudinal section, you can see sort of the two main atrium spaces that flow down and begin to connect the different spaces. And a large void here as well to offer some of the public space back to the city. In this ground floor plan, you can see a large cut right here made through the center and exists as sort of this plaza for people to enjoy. Zooming to the left, this side consists of mainly retail and public space and functions as this multi-functional entrance lobby on the left. On the other side, the retail and lobbies revolve around this social lounge, which is open to the public. And as well, you have these vertical circulation that leads you up to 2nd and 3rd floor retail, as well as office spaces. Here on the 3rd floor, it is accessible by these vertical cores, as well as this escalator that begins on the ground level. Over on the left is the main auditorium space, as well as exhibition spaces for a gallery. On the right, it is connected by an elevated walkway, and this side consists of large food court that is used by the residents, office workers, as well as the public. On this particular residential floor, you have the housing on the left and micro-unit housing, hotel, and transitional family housing. Zooming in on the left, you have the low to mid income housing, as well as the transitional family housing shared by this large atrium cut. And on the right, you have the micro-unit housing with its separate chunk, as well as the boutique hotel, separate chunk. And the way to bring people together is through these elevated walkways across these atriums into a shared communal space. And in this case, on the 11th floor, it's a fitness center. So going back to this idea of the monolith, I was interested in exploring how levels of transparency and this repetitive ruffling pattern of the building envelope may affect how we read this mass. In this aerial view, for example, the perforated ruffle could reveal the fragments left behind and unite this to become this coherent mass. But at the same time, I wondered whether this kind of ruffling pattern could heighten this monolithic quality. Here you can see sort of these figures cut by these primitives that begin to shape this facade and this perforated screen, casting these shadows along the street. And lastly, this is a cut along the corner to really lift this entrance and draw the users in, but also define a boundary of the groundscape leading up to the entrance. And thank you very much.
Kevin, you got me on board right away when you said a ruffled monolith. I had no idea what that meant, but I think that's a really interesting start point. So around that, a bunch of things came to mind surrounding that, but some of them questions and some of them thoughts about what that might mean. But I was wondering, for example, what you were thinking about when you started looking at that subject. For example, I started thinking about the Friedrichstrasse Tower that Mies did, the sort of angular, faceted building that has so much reflection, so much kind of animation in its skin that one could imagine it as a kind of a ruffled monolith. I also thought, I don't know if you've ever watched Snoopy cartoons, but there's a character in Snoopy who's called Pigpen, and he has these kind of lines around his head all the time. That's because he stinks, he smells, and those are kind of radiant, ruffling, stinky lines coming out of his head. But I was struck by, in your project, I was trying to figure out what's a ruffled monolith? What happens at the perimeter of architecture that allows that notion of a kind of monolith to somehow be of value to you? It seems to me it would open up ways in which one obtains access to a form, the way one walks through a facade, the way an inside is related to an outside, the way a program might be grasped by an envelope. All kinds of things come forward there. But I was trying to figure out, like, your plans don't necessarily move in that direction. They don't necessarily follow through on that ruffling. But I was trying to figure out what your aims are with that characterization of your start point.
Yeah, so it really began in our initial exercise. I was looking at this generic box and I was trying to find a way where you can texturize this box and begin to create this kind of texture along the facade. And through some explorations, you can see here, I found these kind of primitive cuts work well with this ruffling texture. And when you look at this sort of texturized box from different angles from the street, you begin to have different reads of this sort of thin perforated screen. You can sort of see in this image here.
I wonder if you could step a little further there. I think what you're describing are techniques for accomplishing something. I'm intrigued by your facade. I'm intrigued by what happens when those primitive extractions meet this repetitive folded skin. There's something interesting that happens at the interplay between those two acts. But I'm trying to figure out what you would draw out of that as a conclusion. It's a little bit technique heavy, what you're describing, as opposed to
right.
What you obtain from that technique.
Mm-hmm. I think it's mainly this sort of visual thing where these recognizable primitives, once cut into this building, begin to form these spaces because it's done through several planes. For example, you have it done on the facade and then also the floor plate as well. And then once you make that one single cut, it kind of applies this sort of effect on multiple surfaces.
I think that's interesting. I don't want to take up too much time here. I'll back away from this, but I think what's interesting there is you could argue, I think if I understand right, the point you're making right now, the folding of the skin and the plates that go up in the section of a building, when they're cut by a primitive, they produce that kind of ruffling, whatever it might be. And one could imagine as you approach that from the outside, from the inside, programmatically in terms of how you move around, there's something to be obtained in exactly that intersection of your primitive and those striations of space that are quite normal in a lot of architecture, but it's in that interaction between the two. I think there's a gold mine in there. I think it's really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm struck by the effectiveness at which you're able to take a kind of binary and use it to activate a lot of the projects. So if you zoom in on your section, and I think it's both of the guys. I mean, that's the ruffled monolith is basically a kind of contradiction, right? You know, that's the idea of the ephemeral and the massive, and you know, the striated and the blocky. And I think your section, particularly your long section, I think it's clear that what you're setting up is, okay, I've got this kind of stacking of floor plates, and you have oddly high parking, oddly low housing, but that's another issue. You've got this stacking of these floor plates, and then it's clearly different and clearly identifiable where you've cut these voids, right? And I think that the next step would want to be to go beyond simply the registration of difference, but to actually, what are the consequences you get out of these things? And so when you move to your plan, I mean, part of what I'm interested in is where do these two come together, and what are the places? If you go to your upper plan, my worry is a little bit, particularly at the housing level, where you get the single loaded corridor, or it's really, and then it opens up to an atrium and you just get a void. Is this enough of a payoff, right? So if you're going to play this difference, which I think works as a kind of diagram scale, does it play out in the specifics? If this is housing, would you really want a big atrium, which is basically a kind of visual mechanism to release from the density? Is that enough of a payoff, or would you want something else in here? And then that would kind of lead to other, you know, is it better off that actually you don't have a void, but you might have a two-story program that fits in here, that just the double height space is enough to get what you want, et cetera, because you're getting plenty of light and air from the other side. So I guess so that would be my question to you, which is, I really like the strategy. I think there's some real intelligence going on here. But you're at the stage now where the specifics of how you actually move beyond the kind of diagram into something that really accelerates into a kind of more creative manifestation, not just, that's when I think things are going to get really, really interesting. So
Thank you.
Can we go back to the long section, and then I want to flip back to this plan? So I think there's something that, you know, you started us off with an intriguing title, and I think your exploration's interesting because you kind of set your own boundaries of it. But I look at the section and I look at the plan, and I worry about this thing that happens quite often when you have a very tall building that you try to carve out, and I'm not sure that you're getting the light and space creation that you think you are. And I could be totally wrong, but I just look at, and sometimes when you go back to like the old way of doing architecture, where you literally put layers of plans on each other, and you suddenly went, oh my God, I cut off the light that I thought I had on level 2, you know, on level 7, because I projected this thing out. So that bothers me because of this. Housing has very different needs than hotels, and you know, you'll hear me talk about this a lot. I mean, I love floor making. I worked for firms that did big forms, and we did holes in buildings, and you know, and things like that. But the real success, I think, ultimately in architecture is we're making buildings for people, and if your exploration isn't also about that placemaking, that experience making, then we're more sculptors than we're architects. You know, we could get into the debate of, you know, Frank Gehry versus Gaudi versus, you know, Michael Maltzan or something like that. And there's great photo ops, and then there's great places to be, and then sometimes there's both, and that's the real successful project. So I'm kind of curious, like, what would be your favorite place in this building?
I would say somewhere here.
And why is that?
I think because this atrium cut penetrates through both the housing and office space, and then you have these sort of hanging community spaces that sort of revolve around this atrium.
Nice. I like that answer. So then I only have one more kind of comment question to put out there. When I saw the plan, and let's go back to that.
Yep.
Let's see. That one. And then there was one other one, I think the one that has all the logos on it.
Okay.
I thought immediately of new airport design, which is a fascinating thing because, right, like nobody stays at an airport for longer than hopefully a day, right? But it's become very important in airports to make places, to make a set of experiences, to be able to like live a full day while you're there. And so that's something that I think you're onto and you should keep exploring because it's truly a transformative way of approaching architecture. You know, how do you make a place that have impact really quickly? And then what if you start to say, it also needs to be experientially durable.
Mm-hmm.
Nice work, though.
Thank you.
Hey, Lance, I'm not sure. I don't know if this was the way you were framing the comment about plans on top of plans or say program types on top of program types. But that strikes me as another really interesting opportunity to figure out how this plan is ruffled. In that sense, for example, the lowest hanging fruit to diagram that is probably the parking garage. Everybody's familiar with the parking garage having a kind of a structural problem that's very different from the housing up above it or whatever, the office space up above it, that those two demands often produce a kind of disconnect in the section in some way. But it seems to me that you could take, I'm now sort of turning back toward you, Kevin. I would take Lance's comments and I would see them as an opportunity.
Okay.
In other words, when housing sits on top of workspace or sits on top of institutional space or any particular program resides over another one, that means there's a kind of a jittery relationship from one floor to the next that you could exploit. Mm-hmm. And this isn't so much a problem to be solved as an opportunity for you in some way. So I would, it would be interesting, for example, to go through your building and draw the whole thing as pairs of plans. Never let one plan be drawn alone without seeing what's below it and what's above it at the same time. And insist that somehow there's an opportunity there. Don't insist on their alignment, but insist on the exploitation of the rub between them in some way.
For sure. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very insightful. I think sometimes we can speak so, esoterically, and I guess it really comes down to this, right? You wake up every day and you have a set of rituals and habits and things that you do, and there's things that hopefully you get to choose that you like, and places you go, and you take a certain path. And I think that if you did that in your building, that ruffling, that richness would really make it be immediately evident. That's the thing. Like, what would it be like, right, to walk from my apartment downstairs to grab a coffee, to go take my kid to school? What is that experience like, and how do you do that three-dimensionally?
Yeah.
That's the richness that you started for us all.
Kevin, nice project, and I think Paul was putting his finger on the issue, which in some ways is the problem of the void. You have a very big site,
mm-hmm.
and you have a building that fills out the site, and of course all the void is the unwritten program to help fill it, even though you're using it as a subtractive measure. So the question of the width of the building in plan is dictated by the site. The building, if it were half as wide as the site, wouldn't have the internal volume to impregnate all the air into it. So you make it the same size of the site. And one starts to, like the old adage of work fills the time. Well, here's where bubbles and voids fill the space, right? And in some ways, it's an imprisoning problem. You have to continue to deploy bubbles of space, right? And while we're doing that, we think that, of course, they're more interesting than the backfill of the housing. And the backfill of the housing is an offset layer, you know, to the big facade project. So on the one hand, except for a theater, the rest of the voids are they take on their identity just simply based on their shape as opposed to their program. It's not a It's not a forest or a zoo or a planetarium, you know, odd things that somebody like Shumi would throw in to create programmatic difference. In other words, it's the sublime nature of designing the space, you know, as a brilliant thing that gives it purpose, which in some ways in the hands of certain architects works on its own, Alvaro Siza or somebody like that, and other architects it becomes an albatross to have to just continue designing that in there. So in a way, your project's it presents the limits of that, or the vicissitudes and problems of that kind of issue. And I can see when you look at the plan, the offsets are about trying to get to the point where the project looks like it's populated with nothing. Am I right?
You're saying the retail?
No, all the voids that you carved into the project.
Yeah.
You know, from the very beginning, you knew that you needed a figural device that was going to allow the project to get filled up in reverse. All the issues of the qualities of the building, which are completely opposite to the previous project, that you'd use repetition, in this case, a fine grain exotic repetition of these serrated or ruffled, you know, skin to create the interest. You can't have interest unless you've got a certain level of wallpaper background, right, to read it. But I think, and the exterior works really well at that level. I mean, I wish that on the interior, maybe the voids were more banal or filled with trees only, or inaccessible, or let's say a conceptual overlay to them in terms of what they would do to affect life within the building, even though they could still be deployed the way in which you're talking about. So it's like writing a text or a program for the nothing, for the void, and giving it different kinds of purposes. That might be something to think about.
Yeah.
That made me think, Neil's comments made me wonder just how much, well, just about the approach in general, whether the voids are actually, if they can be conceived as voids, or maybe if another way to think about it would be, and approach the problem would be like, how much of the building do you really need to enclose, and how much do you not, as opposed to the kind of like, I know you conceived of the project as a monolith, and so then once you do that, there's a kind of degree of like excavation or subtraction or whatever the technique is, or however you want to name it. But I think you can still, whatever work the idea of a monolith does in a city, I think you can still kind of deploy that without having it actually be so monolithic and filled mostly with, I see it as being filled mostly with pancake floor slabs, really, than voids. I almost think that there's like not enough. So not enough void, so not enough open space. And so I wonder if rather than conceiving them as voids and seeing them as the exception to the project, you start thinking about how much you really need to, I guess, fill up this, how much you need to enclose, or how much you need to kind of separate the kind of exterior environment from an interior, how much of the program that you're inserting really does need to be, let's say, like indoors, and really thinking about what that means really in terms of conditioning space and, you know, all these kinds of things, especially in downtown LA. I mean, I don't know how many times I've walked through downtown LA and like it's hard. It's actually like hard to go inside of places. It's really easy to move through downtown, especially around this area and around the Bonaventure and things like this, which is actually like a mile up the road, like, and stay on platforms that are kind of outside and you're kind of like half in and half out. And I think the kind of wrapper around the project is doing so much to produce a particular reading of it that you almost don't need to literally make this a very like monolithic enclosed thing, and that you can still situate the project that way, or kind of it can do that work rhetorically in terms of how it addresses the city, but perhaps on the interior, it's a much more kind of like open thing, and the void isn't the exception to the norm, but actually becomes the norm, and closure becomes a kind of exception to the void in some way. So the percentage shifts. It would totally change your section and kind of totally change your project in a way. I think you wouldn't end up with floor slabs that are filling up a volume that you then excavate. I think you'd end up with a much more refined edge between what's inside and what's outside. And it really becomes about the kind of calibration of enclosure or something like this.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Erin. An early version, there are two ways to that I'm listening to that, and I find it interesting in both of them. One of them is a kind of an overall less monolithic approach to the building, but the other one is the skin itself. And it made me remember a really early iteration of MVRDV's Villa VPRO that proposed having no skin. It was a kind of an air curtain system that was just all open everywhere, and it wasn't really tenable. I mean, it didn't happen, so it wasn't tenable. But you could imagine in certain climates that would become far more tenable in certain ways. And you know, lots of modernity played out across the Southwest simply for that reason, because of the way the climate works. But I think that's a really interesting comment about the skin itself maybe being more open to speculation about what you're doing there.
Okay, thank you everybody for all your comments. Kevin, you really did do a great job pulling this together.
Thank you.
And I think the comments are right on, so I'm not going to say too much more. But you know, you had a great first initial start. I'm happy the ruffles became your theory, so that was great. Okay, thank you everybody. Let's just move on.
So as I was saying before, my project, Pan Theater, is comprised of interlocking and interlaced blocks that are stitched and sutured together through different carvings and scores that I've made in the mess. This was in an attempt to create more public kind of eddies through the flow of downtown LA, areas that people can come stop in for a little while and draw them into the building, which is why I've chosen to include my retail primarily on the bottom floor of the building, with a few other places throughout. One thing that was particularly challenging with a project like this, especially with residential and having a mix of private and public areas, was making sure that the residences had the privacy that they needed, as well as access to all of the facilities and amenities of the building. So my various housing typologies that or the more permanent housing typologies are all located in like the top few floors of the building, with the boutique hotel and transient hotel kind of in the middle above the existing retail. As you can see in my first ground floor plan, I attempted to create more landscaped and areas that kind of interspersed the bottom floor and played between the exterior and interior spaces. One of the spaces in that was included in the program was this idea of a combined exhibition and lobby space, which I thought was a really good opportunity, not only to for people who are just beginning to learn, or first time visitors to the project would be able to experience and learn more about the building that they're visiting as they enter and move through it. As you can see here, this is one of the views of one of my courtyard spaces. One of the things I was really interested in is when looking upwards, as so many buildings kind of draw your attention upwards, I wanted to play with the idea of like having a singular mass or like a homogeneous ceiling above you. So I wanted to have all of these masses layered on top of each other, creating almost like a layered city, in order to make it more interesting and breathe more life into these atrium and courtyard areas. So you can see here with the different carvings that I attempted to achieve in the mass of my building. They interplay between creating these solid, very heavy masses, and I attempted to break them up using the scores, the sutures. One thing that you can see in this area below is a kind of open or semi-interior, semi-exterior theater space with atrium seating that would allow this courtyard area here to be activated at certain times, as well as provide seating for the public in a more comfortable area. This level 9 floor plan shows a kind of mixed level of a office, retail, and residential space that all share a terrace that sits above the street, way above the street level, in order to give more privacy and create a more hospitable and relaxing area. With this, and you can see in the level 11, I have another terraced area, this time incorporating the urban farm, which was part of the kind of unscripted public space that was included in the brief of this project. I chose to incorporate the idea of urban farms and gardens in order to continue to foster that idea of community building, community space, and collaboration, especially between these very different and disparate kind of housing typologies, as we range from high to low to transitional family housing. Finally, I have some elevation studies that I wanted to share with you all. One of the challenges with like having these different masses, I thought it was really interesting that each module could read as an individual, but also together as a whole. So I was experimenting with different kinds of screens, translucency, mass, and screen areas. Thank you.
You know, one of the things I find really interesting about and I think it shows up in this image really well, is that a lot of your effort has been trying to break down the scale of this mass, right? It's a big building. You're articulating. Actually, one of my favorite drawings is your program diagram that showed all of the different program types. It was the most complicated program diagram we've seen today. Like it was a cacophony of colors, like all these things mixing together. So, and no, it's nothing to apologize for. Actually, I think it speaks to the ambition of the project, which is to take this super large project and to try to find a way to break it down into parts that then become a kind of legible architecture, right? And frankly, if you pull up your elevation again, one other thing that's very striking is that you've gone through a huge amount of effort in producing in a sense independence for each of these volumes. They're not only different shapes, they start at different heights, they have different window types, and they're all at a scale that are too big to be a single floor and too small to be the whole building, right? So they're, it's kind of like, it's this weird unit. And then you get when you see people and trees, all of a sudden it becomes really strange. Like what are these things? Are they like stacked landscapes? Are they individual programs? Where's ownership? Where's program? Even the notion of a window, is it someone's window or is this a view into a much larger space? I think that's where the project is most interesting. I think there are aspects of that are underdeveloped. I think the plans, I would want you to take your plan and say, all right, if I had to rent this and make money from it, what am I gonna have to do? And you're gonna have to like take all the excess circulation and fill it up and get into a level of density. But the strength of the project is I think this really interesting approach at the level of producing autonomy or pieces that are legibly different, but then trying to find a way that there's a kind of coherence of the whole thing. And then these landscape cuts that are just brought into it. It's not something that I think is cliched or well known. I think you're onto something really interesting that's worthwhile developing further.
Thank you.
I'll go. Obviously, I'm happy to see trees and people, and I certainly appreciate your your desire to try to build community within all those disparate components. As Paul was saying, like this is a classic thing as a reviewer to see a building and go, oh, I'd love to finish that. I saw your plans, I'm like, all right, he's thought about it, but he didn't get into it. And maybe that's okay. And then I look at, I did the same thing. I look at the facade, I'm like, oh, I'd love to do this and this and this. And so I'm a little at a loss of how I could be helpful. I think Paul said a lot very well. I'm intrigued, I'm hopeful about it. I do like that you managed to do something where you made a very large, very heavy building not feel so heavy. I think you managed to somehow make those lower floors and that engagement with the street really possibly wonderful. It's not a street wall, but it doesn't necessarily like break up the harmony of an urban environment. And then doing that very smart thing too of put the residences up and let them enjoy the views, because it's really surprising. I have several projects in the area, and there's phenomenal views in the Skid Row, Fashion District area that if we're lucky will never be completely obscured. You get great airflow and things like that. So, I mean, I think you've really done something bold, and I'd love to see you also do that terrifying step of how do you put program in a detailed way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I agree with the comments that have been made, Ryan. I think there's something very interesting in what you're setting up. And in a way, it's triggered already by your kind of peculiar giant labels on your sheets. They make me think of restorations of classical sculptures where there are pieces missing and somebody had to leave a little bit of space in between them with a wire or something. And so, and I thought, oh, that's sort of intriguing. I look at these elevations and it seems there's some interesting stuff lurking in here in a disciplinary sense. One of them is, and this has been referred to already several times, this kind of hell-bent desire that we have today to break down scale, which frankly I'm not that on board with. I don't know why we would be ashamed of architecture to the extent that we have to continually break down its scales and somehow imagine that it's small. But in any case, it's in the air, so here we are. And one way to look at what you're doing is as a kind of bounce off the bottom of that condition. And one could say that you're intimating holes in the WHOLES sense. And I like that idea. In other words, you're intimating the completion of that title. You're intimating the completion of this as a more, whether it's coherent, singular, or somehow aggregating thing. It's sort of tilting back toward reassembly as opposed to dissipation. And so I'm looking in the project for moments like that. And I would go, I don't think you've gone far enough toward that subject. I think you need to go a lot harder at that subject. But I'm looking for places now where you start to suggest certain things. Like, for example, right here, there's a slot that jumps from one block to another block. That's a Noguchi woodworking technique. Sorry, Nakashima woodworking technique, where you put the kind of butterfly shaped wood between two sides of a crack to somehow hold it together. And that's a kind of a moment in which two pieces are somehow brought together. And one could imagine, for example, this corner and this corner and this corner are similar in their kind of alignment that does that. Of course, there's an optical thing here, which is, this is an elevation. If there's any inward into the paper differentiation, that becomes harder to read. But I'm looking for places where that reassembly is occurring, and I would do more of that. I think it's quite interesting to think about this sort of willful heterogeneity and willful dissipation of the architectural condition having reached a limit condition. You know, the pile, whether it's a Renaudie pile in France or a Softy pile in Montreal, maybe the pile is a kind of a spent project at this point. And maybe we should be a little less obsessed with continual breakdown of scale at some point. And maybe that doesn't mean the monolith anymore, but it means thinking in terms of assembly as opposed to disassembly.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ron. We're going to need to move on, but I think, Ryan, I do appreciate that you have a slightly different urbanistic approach versus the other projects we saw today, where you do externalize much of the open space. And I think you think through it in a really good way. And so I appreciate the way you've gone through this project and done it. Yes, as people said, there's work to be done. So I think you know that. And I think you had some great comments. And that last one about how you understand the breakup of these pieces, I think is a really interesting one to keep thinking about. So thank you. And we're going to move to our last project for the morning. This is Trevor. So,
hey, everyone.
Thank you, critics.
Hey, Ron, Paul, Neil, Erin, thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So, can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. Yeah, so my project is called Compartmented Cohesion. And I just wanted to start off with a quick rendering to get you guys acclimated to the project. So there's that. I think we can skip over the site stuff because Stephen kind of went over it. So the project revolves around three main concepts. The first being the dissimulation conceptual framework that we did in the beginning of the studio. So I'll go on and talk about that in a couple of slides. And then the next idea that I wanted to incorporate in the project was exterior circulation. So I wanted to connect the street with the building and give the building some sort of life through circulation on the exterior. And the last thing was allowing that circulation to bleed into the interior and have a network of paths within the building that give the building a little more life and not as monolithic. So starting off with the simulation, at the time that I designed this, I was working for Neil, and you know, obviously I was a big fan, or I still am a big fan. So some of his moves kind of rubbed off on this exercise, but essentially it was about taking discrete masses that were simply but sort of carefully designed, and putting them together in a way that they don't necessarily intersect, they just share faces. So when they share faces, it starts to blur the line between what the mass is as a whole and what the different parts are. So exploring part to whole relationships was the whole point of this exercise. And then just taking a look at the elevation, the project was, you know, heavily reliant on this Main Street elevation, because the other elevation you don't really see. It's an alleyway, probably a one-way. It barely even fits one car, so it's pretty tight back there. Wait, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, so in order to create like differentiation within the mass, it was really hard, because when I designed that first study, having the separate discrete masses share faces didn't create a real porous interior. So the third concept with the interior circulation revolves around intervention within the masses themselves. So on the exterior, you can see that exterior circulation, and then it's very different when you move into the interior. So walking through the plan, this is the ground floor plan. When you enter the building on Main Street, you can see number 12 there. You enter into a small gallery space with a large sculptural staircase in the center, and later on we'll get to the atrium space that exists above the gallery, because that's part of the concept. But yeah, you walk in and there are restaurants, retail, gym, and then on the left-hand side of the screen you can see the office lobby, and then on the right-hand side you can see the hotel lobby, and then in the center on the alley side you have the transient hotel and a large generous space given to the people for sort of laboratory space and exam rooms and health services. So moving up to the third floor plan, this is basically the community floor, but there's a small section for creative office space. I wanted to concentrate the community spaces into larger areas, because the programs are so diverse that you want people to concentrate into large areas instead of dividing people by creating numerous social sort of community spaces. So that's what I did here. I took a huge void out of the center of the building that you can see in the elevation, and basically I wanted to turn it into like a small park, like a compressed highline idea. And then various other programs like a market hall on the right-hand side and a ballroom for the hotel and some more retail. And then the 7th floor plan, this is your typical housing floor. I was able to compact the hotel down on the bottom right-hand side and give the micro-unit housing and the hotel some social spaces to share. In the center of the building, number 24, there is a sort of a large community space where people can congregate. And then, as you can see, there are a number of apertures, or sorry, not apertures, atriums throughout the floor plan. And I wanted to create sort of a visual connection between the different floors, and these void spaces can turn into slivers even. So there's always sort of a visual connection between these different floors. Even if they compress and they pinch, they open up, and they do interesting things to create sort of an energetic interior space. So moving on to a section perspective that I did, you can see one of those atrium spaces that acts as a light well, but also acts as an activation space for the different programs that exist on the other sides of that atrium. And I kind of use this technique throughout the building because the masses became so big that they didn't create sort of their own sectional qualities. I needed to intervene and do those separately. So you can see again in section this atrium idea. And then this is a slightly outdated plan, but it kind of gives you an idea of how you rise through the ground floor and into the public sphere. So just some quick visualizations, looking at how the exterior circulation activates the street and activates the relationship between the facade and the city, and how those sort of the variation of the balconies that pop out of the building kind of give the building like a cool energy to it. And then again, from the northwest corner, you can start to see the skin that I applied on the exterior of the building that gives people on the lower floors more privacy, but also is porous enough that allows you to view the exterior circulation on the outside of the building. So yeah, my detailed chunk is slightly technical, but it also details that open gallery space on the ground floor. Those two floors on the bottom are underground, they're parking. And then you can also see the sculptural staircase that exists in the ground floor. And then on the fourth level, you can start to see the network of paths that start to emerge out of the interior when you create these slivers of void space in the floor plan. And then again, just looking at the detailed chunk a little closer up, you can just see the plan start to taper and split and do interesting things with the circulation. Yeah, this image came out a little blurry, but I just wanted to detail the GFRC skin that I've applied to the building. It acts as a skin, but it also, when it hits the opaque walls, it sort of becomes like a cladding system and gives the building an interesting texture. And it all moves in the same direction, so it has a certain directionality to it and moves your eye across the building in elevation, I believe. So yeah, finishing up with an interior shot of that gallery space, and looking at textures and how to treat certain services and looking at how to deal with the edges of floor plates and the void space that exists above them. That's it. Thank you for listening.
Trevor, I like listening to you. You're a smart guy. I think you and Neil are good bedfellows in that sense. He's a smart guy too. And I think it's interesting that there's a kind of sympathy in the way that you're thinking and working across certain things you may have seen or maybe are developing out of experiences you've had that way. But most of all, I think it's interesting listening to you. You're an intelligent guy taking up different frameworks. Can you go back to the elevation you showed early on?
Yeah.
That one. What I was struck by in this image was the way in which, in all the darkest parts of this image, which I think I may have misread a little bit, but I was sort of seeing those as recessed. and that in all those dark areas, one could stand in there and all differentiation, all heterogeneity would disappear, that you would only see a kind of single volume of space from any one of those dark spaces. So I think I was kind of reading this maybe incorrectly, but I was struck by the idea that you could pile all this stuff together, and that inside in those cavities, let's say if I read those as cavities, these could all be understood as disappearing and you're standing in a kind of single coherent sort of entirely unique space of some sort, but not one that sort of is surrounded by difference in any way, shape, or form. I thought it was really, really interesting to contemplate how that might happen in a section like this. And your section actually does that also. The gray drawing with the white lines on the gray drawing, it shows a little bit of that similar property. The perspective you show at the very end doesn't so much. So I don't know to what extent you're trying to do this or not trying to do this. The perspective at the end, the interior view, is quite, you know, you're inside a collection of things as opposed to inside a single thing. But I found that kind of interesting, very interesting to think about the assembly of all of these masses producing that prospect of unification somehow on the inside.
Yeah, absolutely. The conglomeration of masses created a pretty monolithic building that I needed to do something about and intervene in some way. So this is what I came up with.
What drives you to do that? I'm trying to pick a fight with you here. What drives you to do that?
Sorry, drives me to do what?
To need to somehow take a single thing and break it all apart.
Because it's such a big building, and I think you guys discussed this earlier, right? I tried to build something that was relatively monolithic, and it was strange. It didn't work. I want to express that I would say I'm kind of more of an intuitive designer. It's hard for me to explain the design process, but it just didn't feel right.
Mm-hmm. I think I wouldn't stop there, Trevor. I think you're a bright guy. I think you gotta sort of step into that a little bit. So I would probably not have taken the bait that I was trying to lay out for you, but I would have maybe tried to articulate the way in which wholes and parts behave in new ways relative to one another. So we may not reconvene architecture in a way that's entirely singular or entirely monolithic, but I think in these voids inside your building, you're reconvening it in a quite new way. And it nonetheless is a kind of reconvening. It's no longer breaking it all apart again, as I was referring to earlier. I think that's actually quite exciting.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to do something new on the interior, and I started to use that pinching technique that kind of is a language on the exterior with the circulation paths. The interior also sort of has that pinching technique that allows like a visual connection between floors. So you see a lot of energy and you see a lot happening, but you might not necessarily be able to get there immediately.
Trevor, on the circulation pathways on the facade.
Yeah.
What do those pathways, what points do they connect and what do they serve, so to speak? I know that they're migrating to the exterior, so they serve the effect of visually connecting an animate aspect to the project, but are they completing circulation loops? Are you getting more exposure to something?
Yeah, they are essentially completing circulation loops. They're basically connecting people in housing programs that they connect people in housing programs to main community spaces.
So there are units accessed off the exterior
Not necessarily. They're like access points that corridors lead to from units. I don't know if I necessarily detailed that in plan, but that was the idea. They're like outlets from housing programs that allow you to access those pathways that get you to more public programs, more community spaces.
Are they, I guess what I'm driving at, of course, is on the one hand, a project this big, if you were to design it, design it in the most straightforward fashion, then the circulation would be hardcore and direct and based on, housing typology. To over-determine circulation to provide more loops, more options, we either put it into the realm of pure experience, or we look at it in the realm of different itineraries, as though the building really is like a city. Today I want to take the freeway, tomorrow I want to take the scenic route. It's not put together in terms of efficiencies. And so like an ant farm where we're constantly seeing and cutting through the fascination of, movement through solid. One of the curious things about it is it's almost like you want to believe that the building is so populated like a city that multiple ways to navigate would be completely full of people all the time. To think about a project where you provide more options also produces potentially the sense that no one would ever get there, right? And so the idea of pushing the circulation to the perimeter as a way to, it's only as good as the number of people that are in it, in theory.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's the rhetoric, as opposed to, let's say, just having voids come to the perimeter of your building where it's not about the demand for whether or not I see, bodies moving in space.
Mm-hmm.
And that's definitely one of the challenges and the pitfalls, I think, and we've seen it in all projects, is the optical nature of breaking up, a giant building. By what means? By, carving and sculpting on the one hand, or in this particular case, trying to add the idea of circulation as being readable. Like I was going to say that on your previous colleague's project, the amount of pixelization was incredible, especially the last images with the red facade, but it also was still visually impenetrable at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe because it wasn't resolved in terms of windows and things like that. Whereas you're trying to allow this sense of penetration, so to speak. But I either wish that there were no program where some of the circulation was, so that the circulation wasn't always a pathway or a corridor loaded to the perimeter of the building, versus something that was much more slippery in terms of its typology. In which case, the way in which people would use it would be more unpredictable in a way. But your instinct, your intuitive instinct to migrate it to the end of the building, or the building is always just a series of very loose layers where you're going to run into circulation into it, is a good strategy for the project.
Thank you.
Trevor, I don't remember if I've met you before, or if it's because you remind me so much of myself at your age. And I'm not even going to try to say that I'm as talented as you are, but I look at your drawings and they remind me, my thesis project was the Board of Education property that now is the OMA school north of downtown, which meant it was this huge site, a couple of blocks long. My drawings were like 7 feet long and like 4 inches tall. and everyone got upset. I had 2 professors walk out because they couldn't, they didn't want to get up and get close to the drawings. But the bigger thing was, like, I had done an urban cemetery after the riots. And so I was seeking meaning in architecture. And I see that in what you're doing. Like, you have so much going on in your head. You said it, you're intuitive. You have so much going on in your head and you're processing so many things because you get that they all matter. You get that what it's like to be in a building matters. You get that a building impacts the place that it's in. You get that this thing's still got to stand up. You clearly love systems and materials. And, you know, I was totally intrigued by your use of GFRC and understanding, and not even trying to say like it's structural, because it's not right now, right?
Yeah,
it's lace. You know, Zaha's building in Miami is beautiful and the interior spaces are amazing. The GFRC is not what's the success of her building in reality, because it's all cladding. But I think what I want to encourage you to do, as I listen to you and I listen to people try to extract more of the story, is you need to go into another uncomfortable zone and diagram what you've done. You know, some people design via diagram and other people do, and then they diagram it. And if they get the chance, they tweak it. And sometimes you don't get a chance to tweak it. And all you do is you go, okay, next project, I learned something from this. And you might even want to add color in your diagrams. And maybe you never show it to anyone. But you know what I mean? Like, I get the black and white and the grays. And that's what you have inside of you right now. You have so much gray of, you're not sure that it's important, but it's important to you. And that exploration, it's so key to your success, is being a thoughtful contributor to society, is that willingness to say, like, it's not black or white, right? That buildings, yeah, I get that they're done this way, but why? I mean, I love that. You know, you could nail it right now, but then you're just going to be dismayed later on in life when the developer comes in and tells you, like, they're not interested. And that's why your diagram matters too later on, because you still have to sell your project to someone else. You have to sell it to the developer. You have to sell it to the planning department. You have to sell it to the people who have so many choices, especially in a city like Los Angeles. Where are you going to shop? Where are you going to live? And I think I would be very sad if I don't see your name on many, many more projects in the future.
Wow, thank you. That's really nice of you.
But you have to communicate. You got to find a way to get it out of you. Not
Absolutely.
just in drawings.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So look, I by the way, I'm really enjoying concept board for this project, because, you know, there's a lot more that you've drawn than what you've articulated. There's a richness to this project. And also there's kind of weird, you know, there's a reduction of the palette. You did everything, as was mentioned, in black and white. And I'm trying to figure out how effective that was. Did the coding of the black and white actually undermine the kind of sculptural legibility because it turns it super graphic? Does it actually, my worry is that it tends to code things in a kind of binary that we were talking about in a previous project, whereas I think the richness of the project, what you're trying to explore with the Brise Soleil, is that you get a kind of sequence of veils that go over top of a series of solids and voids, so you get a more complex reading of the building. And I think, oddly, the graphic effect is taking away from some of those spatial complexities and maybe even the kind of atmospheric effects, et cetera. But I want to just step back and say that there are aspects of this that are really well developed. I love the fact that there's the detail of even reception desks, and that makes me wonder, like, can you exit out the back of a reception desk, which is great to look at, even to be able to bring that up as a question. But I think there's some real richness to what's going on here. But I do think that the alignment between a kind of representational strategy, a material strategy, a volumetric strategy, and an urbanistic strategy is not quite meshed. They're super emphatic right now, but they may be going in directions that take away from some of the complexity you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. Thank you.
But it's a super interesting project and it's a joy to look at. So it's probably the best way to put it.
Were you able to access the concept board?
Oh yeah, I'm on it right now. So.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Cool.
No, I've been enjoying the concept board all day. So it's
awesome.
Thank you to everyone for doing that work. Thank you, Stephen. It's great to have.
I wasn't sure if you guys were able to see the concept board stuff. That's great.
Yeah, Trevor, I guess I would just echo everything that's said. And I guess I want to add just, I mean, there's a ton of program in the building, or I don't even know if that's the right word. There's a ton of different kinds of spaces that required the labeling of them as such, as different. And I mean, maybe I'll just go back to this conversation about difference and the expression of it in the project. It seems like there's an interest in maintaining some ideas about discontinuity or the kind of expression of it, but then trying to then develop techniques and devices that pull things together, right? Like,
Pretty
so you
much,
have,
yeah.
What?
Yeah,
so
that's pretty much it, yeah.
And I guess I wonder, like, how many things need to start out as different to begin with in order to then need to unify them. And it seems like most of the difference is produced really just somewhat superficially through the form, but that actually on the interior, all of these kinds of like boutique hotel lobby, transient hotel lobby, like, I don't know what actually the difference is between those things, why they're necessarily called out as different, and what techniques you've developed that can produce more kind of cohesion between them, or if there really is an interest in keeping difference between all these things and socioeconomic classes and all of that. So I guess I really like would applaud the clarity of the interest in the project. And I think there's potential for it to extend beyond, for sure. I know, I mean, maybe this is going back to something Lance was saying too, beyond the form and the kind of facility you have with representation and all of these things, to really think about, well, how much difference do you really want to produce between the types of spaces that are for certain people versus the types of spaces that are for other people, and if we should really be heightening those things or not, you know? And I think that there's a potential in the project to begin to err on the side of cohesion versus a compartmentalization, I guess, just to borrow the words in your title.
Got it.
You're allowed to jump in and argue with her or say something.
Yeah, I mean, I agree to a certain extent. I just, some spaces need to be separate. I don't know. There has to be some division.
Maybe, yeah, I guess as time is moving, and I think Neil left us. Anyway, I want to thank you all. Trevor, obviously, you know, I've worked with you too, and I enjoy it. And you've been a fascinating person to know and to develop a work with.
Thanks,
great
Steven.
project. I'm really intrigued by your elevations, actually, because they're very curious, very thoughtful. They also very quite challenging the way they undermine the form in a way that still almost lets you see the form. So I do think you actually spent a lot of time on those, and it's pretty sophisticated as everything else was discussed. Very impressive. Probably I would agree with what I think probably the critics are suggesting to you, is that you're probably far more intelligent and capable of understanding the work you do than you're willing to articulate. And I would impress upon you to continue. Hopefully, you know, you're one of those people I hope goes to grad school and chooses a great one that will help you really understand what it is that you do intuitively, that you are great at, so that you can engage in a discourse surrounding the sophistication of the work you're working on. So really great conversation, great work in general. All of you today, the students, fantastic. Reviewers, so fun. Nice to see you. You know, I don't know if you have any last comments, those of you who are still with us. So I don't know if that's what you thought we'd be up to in the last, you know, weeks. I also should really be clear, like, you know, we do have a team of people working with us, and they're fantastic teachers. So
I just realized I posted a comment thinking it was a general comment, and I think I just sent it to Ron. So, but anyway, so yeah, the general comment I was going to make is, look, Steven, you set the students up with a really tough project. I mean, not only is it big, but it's got, you know, intricacy. It's got challenging site, actually, which we didn't really even talk about. The front, back, the side, the depth is too big for a single building, and yet not quite big enough for two buildings. It's a really intricate project. And for me, I think the results across the studio are really, really interesting. Plan, section, elevation, they're all different. There's an evidence of multiple projects in each individual design proposition that was put out here. So, which for me gives you guys a great kind of font of material to continue to develop, whether in the next project, whether over the summer. I think I found this really interesting, in part because the project was so difficult to begin with. So congratulations, Stephen. You challenged people in just the right way. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. They're a particularly strong group for sure, despite the environment that they've had to work in. I have to say this is half the size of what we did last year. So, and it's more successful in many ways, I would argue too. But thank you. They're a great group.
Yeah, I'm impressed, Stephen. You should be very proud of yourself and your students.
I would only echo your comments, Stephen, about not just for Trevor, but the group as a whole. I think there's something very interesting. I think you're downplaying, Trevor, in a way, the value of design work, and to some extent the value of the subjectivities that come along with that design work, as in fact fomenting something intellectual that is important as an outgrowth of that. So it's not so much a missing piece in the sense that it's a blank. It's already loaded into what you're doing, and there are ways in which you can extract that in terms of articulating what Stephen's asking for. But I think that's kind of a lesson for all of us, an ongoing lesson for all of us. And I would encourage you to pursue that. It's not always easy. And I think different people are going to approach it from different perspectives. There are those that will start by writing something, and there are those that will start by drawing something. But at the end of the day, those two are going to somehow engage one another. And I think that's actually pretty exciting in this moment. I think that whatever your next steps are will complement what you're doing now, and you should target exactly how that's going to happen in some form. But I found your project's really interesting. I found the projects all morning or all afternoon now really interesting to think through and discuss with you. So thanks for presenting them. Really great.
Thanks, Ron. Thanks, everyone.
Say something, are you good?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks to all the reviewers. Thanks for everyone listening. Really helpful, really cool. Thanks, Stephen. Cool program.
Congratulations.
Yeah. Nice to see you all.